Another it's not really cross training, but it's something I do to break myself out of the routine, is going back and revisiting old work. And I call that either
Mm.
archive diving or searching for old gold. I think it was Guy Tal that called it archive diving, so I adapted that. I thought that was great.
I like to call it dumpster diving.
Yeah, well, yes, but my stuff isn't in a dumpster. It's old gold. So
Well, you speak for yourself. I'm talking about my
you're talking
stuff.
about your dumpster.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 412 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen. I'm your host, Matt Payne, and I'm so glad you're here for another insightful conversation designed to inspire and elevate your photography journey. This week, I'm excited to have Suzanne Mathia on the show. Suzanne is not only an accomplished landscape photographer, but also an Adobe community expert, making her a treasure trove of knowledge when it comes to creative photography and post-processing techniques. In this episode, Suzanne shares some incredible Lightroom tips and tricks that can take your editing game to the next level. We'll also discuss the concept of creative cross-training, how exploring different artistic disciplines can inspire fresh ideas and make you a more well-rounded photographer. Whether you're looking to refine your post-processing skills or find new ways to fuel your creative spark, you're in for a treat. So grab your notebook and get ready to be inspired by Suzanne Mathia. All right, Suzanne Mathia, it is awesome to finally have you on the podcast.
It's great to be here. I know we've tried to do this a number of times. I tried to put it off so I could become a little bit more interesting, but it hasn't happened, so here I am.
Oh, come on. You are one of those people that sells yourself short all the time.
It's good to be here finally. I know we've been trying this
I'm not,
since March of 2020, I think.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's been a long time actually.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we could pull it off. And you've been a long, long time supporter of the podcast on Patreon. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh,
Appreciate
thank
that.
you. You've kept me company on many a road trip, let me tell you.
Right on. Well, Suzanne, for people who aren't familiar with you and your awesome photography, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name, like you said, is Suzanne Mathia. I am single and I have two sons, one that lives relatively locally, another one that lives out in La Jolla, California, and a number of grandchildren. I've had a camera probably most of my life, but haven't been really serious into photography until about 12 to 14 years ago. I've always had a camera. My father made sure I had one. He was very into photography. So there were times that life had better ideas for me, like having a corporate job and raising kids and doing all that. So once my kids were out on their own and thriving, I decided to quit my ridiculously great paying job that was absolutely stifling and become a full-time professional landscape photographer. And so I always figured that if I could do it for one more year, I'd be good. And so 14 years later, I'm still managing to eke out a living doing photography and doing what I love. I guess I describe myself primarily as a landscape and nature photographer, but I'll point my camera at just about anything I find interesting and compelling and unusual.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning you're really good at it too.
Why, thank you. I
Yeah,
appreciate
yeah, it's
that.
your name comes up all the time when I talk to people, so I think like I said before, I feel like you don't give yourself enough credit for the really great photography that you've created over the
Why,
years, so
thanks.
you
Oh, I
should
appreciate
pat
that.
yourself on the back. All
It's
right.
hard to do. I say we all suffer from imposter syndrome, so I think I probably suffer from that probably more than most people do. I just find it a miracle that I can still do this all these years later, so that's great.
Yeah, I mean, come on, you're amongst the very few that actually get paid to do what we do. So that's pretty awesome.
True that. True that. Yes, I do
Yeah.
consider myself lucky.
Yeah. So you mentioned a stifling corporate job. What was your career path?
I was, believe it or not, I was an underwriter for Lloyd's of London here in the United States. So I had corporate pen for them to write and make contracts for high-end property and casualty in the United States, which is completely different to what I'm doing now.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot. Every time someone asks a photography insurance question on Discord, you're like, let me tell you what to look out for.
That's true. Yeah, every once in a while that insurance hat comes back on, and yes, I can get back into insurance contract mode in a big hurry. But it's a useful set of talents to have, especially within the corporate and the business world that we live in now. It's nice to know a little bit about insurance and contracts and that type of thing, especially with professional photography and liability and equipment insurance. And so that comes up, like you said, in the Discord channel, it comes up quite a bit. But it also comes up in conversations I have with colleagues. I said, you got to watch out for this and watch out for that. And it's funny how quickly it reverts back.
Yeah. Man, we didn't even plan on this, but we could probably do an entire episode on like insuring your camera gear.
Well, that's true too.
And maybe we'll sneak one of those in for like a Patreon bonus episode when we're done.
Oh, that would be fun. Yeah, that would be fun.
Yeah.
I could put the corporate hat back on. Sorry, speaking of corporate hats, so back in the day when I was working corporate, I was working in San Francisco, and literally we would wear a nice hat and a nice suit to work almost every day, looking all fancy back in the day. Yeah. And there were times that I wouldn't leave my office without putting my suit jacket on to go out onto the floor. So, yeah, things have changed a little bit now. I'm lucky if I've got a pair of shoes on.
Right. I'd love to have you take us back to your childhood. I know you had a pretty interesting upbringing. Your family immigrated to the United States from the United Kingdom, and you landed in Los Angeles. And then from there, that kind of formed your entire upbringing and interest in art. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how that all went down.
Yeah, well, so I was born and raised in England, as was my whole family. We were all British. My father was a draftsman and an aircraft designer, and he was working on supersonic transport in England along the same time as the Concorde was being designed. Britain had their own version of the supersonic transport, which was called the TSR-2. And Britain, in their usual wisdom, decided to just scrap the whole TSR-2 project and just go with the Concorde, which left all these British aircraft designers out of luck. So the American companies swooped in and swooped up all the British designers and draftsmen, and it was basically called the brain drain. So they took all the high-paying brainiacs out of the aircraft industry in England and paid for them to come over to the States. So being the brave souls that my parents were, they said, sure, let's go ahead and do that. So I'm an only child, so I just came along as extra baggage half of the time. So, we decided to move to the United States, and that was when I was 12 years old. So I went from a British private school in England and was dumped out on the shores of Manhattan Beach, California, which was a cultural shock to say the least. But it was a really interesting experience, and sort of we all left everything behind, but we gained so much when we came here, and it was a real adventure. I didn't miss England terribly. I was just ready for new adventures when we got here. So my dad worked here in the United States for Northrop and Boeing as an aircraft designer in Los Angeles. We ended up moving up from Manhattan Beach up to Palos Verdes, which was really quite nice on the peninsula there. And then the bottom fell out of the aircraft industry in the United States. So, believe it or not, my dad at that time had dinking around a little bit with metal sculpture. He was just as a hobbyist, he was doing metal sculpture and metal sculptor. And my mom was a weaver, a fiber arts, doing that as a hobby. And somehow, within 3 or 4 months, they decided that they were going to say to heck with the corporate world, and they were just going to be artists and open up an art gallery on Cannery Row in Monterey. So they did. So yeah, so they were very, very successful, and they ended up combining my mom's fiber arts work with my dad's metal work, doing chrome and stainless steel combined with fiber arts, and we're doing huge pieces for installations in corporate offices and airports and that type of thing. So they became really successful. And so, in typical fashion, after they decided they didn't want to do that anymore, they retired and moved to Tortola in the British Virgin Islands. So they just packed up the gallery job and decided to move to Tortola, which was great. Unfortunately, my dad passed away while they were in Tortola, but they had the adventure of having a house out there and sort of living the life out on the islands, which was great. And I think their braveness and their boldness in some of the choices they made in life sort of helped me with my choices. I don't think I've been as brave and bold as them, but at least, it gave me the courage to follow what I really wanted to do and not be too set on my ways in corporate world. So I thank them for that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you guys were kind of immersed in the art scene, and I'd be curious if you could talk a little bit about how being immersed in that art environment informed your later journey into photography.
Yes, well, growing up, by that time I was growing up my high school years in Carmel and Monterey. I can't really call it high school years because I don't think I ever went to school. But I spent a lot of time down on the Big Sur coast with my friends. That was typical California stuff. When I was going to school, they enrolled me in what they called independent study. So as long as I had a project to do for this whatever the semester, and turned in some sort of report for the semester, I didn't actually have to go to classes every day. So I ended up spending a lot of my time roaming around Big Sur, Carmel, and Monterey, spending days down at the Esalen Institute, hanging out with musicians and artists. So that informed most of my high school years, and I managed to graduate high school regardless of the lack of education. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that in England, you start your education when you're like 3.5, 4 years old. So by the time I got to the States, I was already pretty caught up. So I don't think I missed out on too much, except maybe some of the socialization in high school. But it sure opened up a lot of opportunities for exploration, especially, like I said, just around the Big Sur coast. And most of my parents' friends, of course, them owning a gallery, were artists and craftsmen. So I was around people who were doing batik work and sculpture work and, painting and drawing and photography. She had a really good friend that was a photographer. And my dad always enjoyed photography and sort of put a camera in my hand for the first time. I didn't really know what I was doing with it. I just liked to point it at things and hope for the best. And it wasn't until later on I started realizing that there's probably more to the craft that I need to learn and to do it properly. But as I say, always being surrounded by art and artists was a real benefit when I was growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us about your sponge theory. What is even that?
My sponge theory. Well, I don't know if you know the old Seinfeld episode. It has nothing to do with that sponge theory at all. But my sponge theory is not, it's about knowledge. And as you gain knowledge and you gain ideas and you gain things over the years, it's kind of like a sponge. And when you first start out, you've got this dry sponge and you're just willing to learn everything and you just suck it all up. You just get it all in there. And then after a while, after a few years, because the sponge is now all full of knowledge and ideas, it can't absorb really anymore. So my sponge theory is occasionally you have to kind of squeeze that sponge out, get rid of some of those old ideas and allow some new ideas to come in. And I find that that's applicable to photography. There's a lot of ideas that I had, firmly planted in my mind about how to take photographs and what it is to be a photographer and all that stuff. And then my sponge got really full. And anytime I needed to get into some new ideas, there was no room for it. So done a bit of sponge squeezing. And it's things like always using a tripod or not always using a tripod, or ISO versus auto ISO, and wide angle lenses and grand landscapes. Even going to ETTR, exposing to the right, and then digital cameras with ISO invariants, and that may change. Use of graduated filters, all of those things that I was just set in my mind, I realized I can now, squeeze the sponge out a little bit and let in some new information.
What are some of the new things that you're starting to absorb that have improved your approach to photography?
Well, I don't know if it's improved it, but it's relaxed my approach to photography. So I've switched over something. Like I say, I can't imagine ever not using a graduated neutral density filter when taking landscape shots. And now I don't use one at all because I can do a better job in post-processing.
Yes.
And I never used autofocus. I was always a manual focus girl. So I've learned to actually embrace autofocus. I always used hyperfocal distance for focusing, and now I've been known to focus stack occasionally, so there are new things that I'm starting to adapt into my workflow that I always said never to, never go over 100 ISO, never not be on a tripod, never, focus stack or focus a third of the way into the scene, always use your hyperfocal. So I've relaxed on that and just learned to adapt with the new technology and just new information and new experience.
That resonates a lot for me because I feel like if we become too rigid in our approach to making photographs, whether that be how we use our equipment or the techniques that we're employing or the way we even conceptualize what a good photograph even is, if we remain rigid in those ideas, then our photography will stagnate, and potentially even worse, we might grow bored with it and or get left behind in terms of following a different path that might make us more creative or give us more personal satisfaction. So I think losing all that rigidity is like an incredible epiphany that I wish more people would embrace.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that too. In fact, even on this, just came back from Caddo Lake with a group of friends, and I mentioned, because I was shooting some birds, and I happened to mention that I was using auto ISO. And, the neck swivels on my friends was like, you're doing what? Because they know how adamant I was about, keeping your ISO low and all that. And so we had to get into that whole conversation about the new mirrorless cameras and how, it's not quite as important, to worry about such a low ISO. And when you're working in, with birds in flight, it's a good thing to do. But they were all pretty shocked. So that I never thought I'd hear you say that. So it was a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, auto ISO opens up so many opportunities when you're photographing wildlife, especially. Yeah. And if the conditions are dynamic at all, like, it's bright over here, but it's dark over here. Yeah. Like, the last thing you want to be doing is like messing around with your ISO in mid shot. I mean, you're not going to get a good photograph.
Exactly. And in fact, it was the trip I took to Caddo Lake a year ago that got me really interested in doing wildlife photography. I mean, basically a landscape and nature shooter, and if a piece of wildlife would walk through the image, I would take a photograph of it. But after looking at the birds and trying to photograph the birds out at Caddo a year ago, I ended up getting a 100-500 Canon lens. And the new R5, well, it was a new R5 at the time, and really dedicating myself to learning birds in flight and more about wildlife photography, because I would take okay images, but they weren't very consistent and not very reliable. So I made it a real challenge to myself to get that down. There's a park that's close to me that has a lot of actually two parks close to me that have a lot of wildlife, a lot of birds. So I spent almost every day going down there and just shooting birds in flight. We've got a couple of nesting bald eagles close to me, so I got a chance to do that right in the middle of Scottsdale, which was pretty good. So when I went back this year, less birds, but I got better shots. So I was really glad I paid all that time and attention to working on a different genre.
Yeah, definitely. The first time that I started really getting serious into wildlife was 2 years ago, actually, on my trip to Antarctica. And, it's like penguins and birds and, leopard seals. And man, if you're photographing a penguin who's like cruising really fast down the ice, which is not, they can't move that fast, but sometimes they can toboggan.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to get a really good photograph of them and like it's snowing and the conditions are constantly changing, like auto ISO, like just gives you one less thing to worry about.
One less
Slap
thing
that
to
puppy
worry
into,
about.
yeah, slap that baby into f8 and like for a penguin, it's probably like, I don't know, 1/800th of a second or something like that. And you're good to go. You know what I mean? So
Antarctica was an eye-opener for me. That was probably the first place I started shooting without a tripod. I took the tripod with me on one of our first landings and then realized this was going to be an absolute waste of time and effort and space. So I didn't take the tripod out again with me for the rest of that trip. But Antarctica is certainly a place that you feel like it's otherworldly. It's not like anywhere you've been before. You go to Paris, you go to London, you go to even Death Valley or, Havasu Pie. They're wonderful places, but they're somewhat familiar. And you go to Antarctica and it's just like you're on another planet. And it's just amazing. And like you say, the wildlife is just incredible. You try and stay away from them, but they always come to you, It was a great experience to go down there.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's talk about creative cross-training. What is it? Why is it important? And what are your go-to methods of doing it?
Well, creative cross-training for me is when I just get tired of just shooting the same thing over and over all the time, same landscape, same places. I've been teaching workshops for a number of years, so I would end up going to the same place every time, same month, every year, which was great because you get to learn a place and you get a little bit more familiar with it, but it can get into being somewhat routine. So when I start to feel that way, I just like to mix things up a bit. So I will go and try macro or street photography, which I really don't know anything about, but just take yourself downtown and just do some street photography. Working on abstracts, whether it be just shadows and light. I've done a lot of work before with smoke and just doing smoke in a studio and working on abstracts from smoke, drops of water and making water drop machines and, getting double splashes and doing all that. It's fun to do, but you learn a lot of things that you may end up using in your landscape and nature work without realizing it. And it just mixes things up, just change your genre, change what you're doing just for a little bit. Also, too, I like to, if I'm feeling a little routine, I will change the lens I'm using. I'm not using a wide angle lens as much as I used to, so I'll switch to a wide angle lens, or I'll switch to a telephoto lens, or even switch to a macro lens, and that forces me to get down with some intimate landscapes. Another it's not really cross training, but it's something I do to break myself out of the routine, is going back and revisiting old work. And I call that either archive diving or searching for old gold. I think it was Guy Tal that called it archive diving, so I adapted that. I thought that was great.
I like to call it dumpster diving.
Yeah, well, yes, but my stuff isn't in a dumpster. It's old gold, so...
Well, you speak for yourself. I'm talking about my stuff.
You're talking about your dumpster. But I find it's really great. And what I found was, after working with, post-processing and photography for, now it's been almost 14 years. When I go back to the original image, I've got a history state that's about 75 different things that I've done to an image. I'll go back and go to the original import, do 2 or 3 little changes, and it's 100 times better than it was before. So the software's changed, my talent has changed, hopefully improved. And I could love going back and revisiting some images that just didn't resonate with me at first, but now, I really love. And then I've posted them and it seems to resonate with other people as well. So that's been kind of fun.
That is fun. I need to do more of that when I get a free second. I want to talk a little bit more about cross-training. So one of the things that I like to do for creative cross-training is go to like art museums and study different art forms, and especially like painting. It doesn't even have to be landscape painting, just like still life. It's like looking at how they use light or composition or how they arrange shapes, things like that. It can be really enlightening in terms of things that you can kind of put in your creative toolbox for later. So I think that's another great way to do creative cross-training.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. Like, even to the point of reading well-written books. Like, I just finished off reading A Walk in the Park by Kevin Fedarko, who did Emerald Mile, and he just has such a beautiful way of weaving words together. That's just, it makes you see a scene like especially if you've spent any time down the Colorado River and into the Grand Canyon, and even just reading his words evoke some artistic changes that I wouldn't have seen before. But even, like you said, going to a museum, but even something as simple as, and as much as I hate going shopping, but even going to the mall and looking at window displays and how they're doing different things and how different color schemes are coming into fashion, and just different lines and shapes, and like you said, it's just, you just get out of what you're normally doing and you just see things a lot differently.
I don't know if you have read or started to read Guy Tal's new book, Be Extraordinary, but one of the chapters in there, he talks about the classic, oh my gosh, who was it that said, if you want to be a more interesting photographer, become a more interesting person.
Yeah.
And then what Guy Tal says is become a more interested person in order to become a more interesting person, which I thought was a really good insight in terms of studying philosophy, like really leveraging your curiosity around whether it be graphic design or like all kinds of subjects. So I think the more you can kind of branch off and learn different things, it's going to make you a better photographer.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. I'm into chapter 1 in Guy's book. The turbulence on the airplane got a bit much, so I put the book away. But now I'm gonna keep on in. So yeah, he always gives you food for thought. That's for sure.
Well, let's talk about your relationship with Adobe. I'd love to hear how you became an Adobe community expert and what the heck that even is.
Whatever that is. Adobe Community Experts is it's a global program, and it's a network of creatives and freelancers, artists, publishers, bloggers, hobbyists, content creators, trainers, industry people. There's about 400 around the world, of which I'm one of them. And they use their experience and their expertise to like guide and educate and inspire other people to use Adobe software. So we spend a lot of time doing, blog posts and training and that sort of thing, but also doing Q&A on Discord and Reddit and YouTube and, answering all the questions, and then in the Adobe forums as well. So people will go to the Adobe forums if they have a specific problem with a piece of software or something, and all of either the engineers or the people from Adobe Community Experts will chime in and try and answer the problems. It's a really good program. We do a lot of sharing and there's a lot of recognition. Obviously, we get early access. We're doing, a lot of the early releases. So we get a bit of insight into what's coming next. It's all under NDA, so I can't share anything, but it's all good. And there's a lot of networking opportunities and engaging with other community experts. We get a chance to influence a little bit what's going on. We have meetings with the engineers and the designers, so we actually have some hands-on feedback as to, what's coming and, what we can do to improve the software, which is kind of neat. And just sort of being involved in sort of the making of the meat a little bit, or making of the sausage, with Adobe has been really interested. Plus we get a few rewards for doing that as well, which is kind of nice. I was due to go to Adobe Max as a teaching assistant this year, but I started working with Munch Workshop, so their workshop came in right at the same time. So I went to White Sands and did that as opposed to going to Max this year. But Max is the sort of the big convention that all the Adobe people go to every year. It's usually in LA, but this year it was in Miami. So, but next year probably go.
Couple things. So one, we're super happy to have you on board with Munch Workshops.
Happy to be there.
And two, how did you even get started with becoming an Adobe community expert?
Well, I always was answering questions online. So because I've been working with Lightroom since before day one with Lightroom. So, and I've worked with Photoshop as well. I think I'm more of an expert in Lightroom than I am in Photoshop. I'm okay with Photoshop, but I have a website and a web presence called the Lightroom Whisperer. So that's where I do a lot of feedback for questions and Q&A and blog posts and one thing and another with Lightroom. So whether it be Reddit or Discord or YouTube or some of the forums, I would always be in there answering questions as best I could. Not always right, but a lot of the times I was doing okay. So one of the community experts reached out to me and asked me if I would like to join the program. So they recommended me to the program, and I filled out a resume basically as to why they should pick me. And fortunately they did, and I've been really enjoying working with them ever since. I've been doing it now about a year and a half, almost 2 years.
Yeah, and I was, as you were describing kind of what's all involved in that, and I don't know, but I'm guessing you don't get paid for it, but you get access to things early and things like that. But one of the things that it seems like would be really useful for you is that, one, you constantly are staying up to date on the software so that you know what the latest and greatest is, and you're constantly refining your skills and your techniques and the things that you can teach other people, and then obviously you can leverage that information and knowledge to helping other people, which then rolls into workshops and doing one-on-ones and things like that. So it seems like a really great approach to kind of giving yourself extra skills that you can then leverage in your photography business.
Yeah, 100%. I wish I'd have said it that way too. That's absolutely perfect. But that's exactly right. And so what's nice is when a new release is coming out, I've already had a chance to work with it for 6 months. I already know the potential pitfalls and problems. So when it's release day, it's usually 6 a.m. on a given day, we can release our blog posts and our information about upcoming changes or upcoming releases to the software, that I've already worked on it for a while, and so I can answer questions and be ready with information as to what's coming out and how to use it and what the benefits are.
Yeah. Well, let's dive a little bit deeper into Adobe stuff. So you work a lot in Lightroom. What are the top 3 mistakes that you see people making in Lightroom?
Oh, I wish there was only 3.
Right? I get that. I mean, you can do 5 if you want. Suzanne.
Yeah, I think we might have to get to that. So I fortunately, over time, since Lightroom's been out and since people have been working with it for a while, I see fewer and fewer of the major mistakes. The biggest one that everybody used to do, and it's not quite so bad now, is moving files outside of Lightroom, either using Explorer or Finder to rename files, to rename folders, to move out where they are, anything like that. If you're doing it outside of Lightroom, it can be done, But you better know what the heck you're doing, and you better be able to make everything match back up again and spell mother by the time you've finished. But for new users, as soon as they do that, they've reorganized their files, they've created new folders, and they've done all that outside of Lightroom. That's when they get into trouble. And then what they usually do then when they get into trouble, they decide, well, I'll just start another catalog. And so now you've got another catalog, and you've got a second catalog, and that only has half of the images in it. And then the images don't have all the edits because the edits live in the catalog, and so on and so on and so on. And so a lot of the times when I'm helping people sort out messes is I'm helping them get all of their catalogs and their bits and pieces into one place.
I was going to say that's like the number one thing I see people struggling with all the time. And I think it's based on a misunderstanding of what Lightroom even is and how it manages files. And, it's confusing because I remember when I first got Lightroom forever ago, I didn't get it either. It's just, it wasn't intuitive, and you're like Googling and trying to figure it out. And the best way I describe it to people is that I've come up with this analogy that seems to work with most of our clients. And basically, I describe like your photography world as a library, like a physical library that you go to in person. And if you remember, like, you're old enough to remember that when you go to the library, there's books on the shelves. Those are your photographs. Those are your files. And then Lightroom is the actual Dewey Decimal catalog that tells you where those photos live. And if you move those books outside of the catalog system, then you're never going to find that book again.
That's right.
That's the way I like to describe it to people, and that seems to work for people.
That's exactly the analogy that I use, and I use that in my demonstration too. I have the old card catalog, and I have to look around the room and make sure everybody is of a certain age, so they understand what a card catalog is. But yes, that's exactly right. And as I say, the books can be moved on the shelf. They can be moved to another library. They can be checked out, whatever it is. But that card catalog is and you have to keep that up to date. And I always liken it to a spreadsheet that you'd use for a record collection too. Well, that's dating ourselves as well when we have records. But, what genre it is and what the musician is and where it's located on your shelf and, so and so and so and so. So I always tell people that, the Lightroom catalog, like you said, is either like a card catalog or like an Excel spreadsheet on steroids. And that's where all the information about that live. And a lot of people will say that they don't want to use Lightroom because they don't want Lightroom to organize their images for them. And they don't understand that Lightroom doesn't organize the images for them. You organize the images. Lightroom just gets to know where they are and what you've done and where they're located. So I would think those are the two biggies.
And then, of course, like one that I constantly see people struggle with is not understanding like the backups and the files, and when there's a new version, it duplicates the catalog and all of the helper files and all that. So then if you don't stay on top of that, you can end up with like 40 gigabytes of garbage on your hard drive that just can be thrown in the trash. No, usually, as I say, when I'm playing cleanup with people, one of the things we do is go into the files and when we say get rid of, we move all the old catalogs and put it into a file called Old Cats. And I said, in a month or two, if you haven't missed these, and there's nothing going wrong, then you can just go ahead and delete all the old cats. But you mentioned something about backup, and that is definitely one of the other things too, that people used to just assume that when Lightroom was doing a backup at the end of a session, that it was backing up their images. And I have to remind them that it's only backing up the catalog. The images themselves need to be backed up separately. So once people understand that, they say, well, I'm backing it up every time I close Lightroom. I said, no, you're not. You're backing up the catalog and the information about your images, but not the images themselves. So I make sure people have at least two backups. If you're on a Mac, obviously Time Machine, whatever the Windows equivalent is, and then also a cloud backup. And I usually recommend people do Backblaze because,
that seems to work out pretty well. And I've rescued a number of people that, have lost their images for whatever reason. I had a guy the other day that actually reformatted his hard drive. So the internal hard drive to the computer. So, so thank God for
Whoops.
Time Machine. Yeah, whoops. Well, he says, well, I saw you do it on an external, so I thought I could rename this one. I said, no, let's not do that. So fortunately, as I say, we have Time Machine as a backup, and we also had Backblaze as a backup. So managed to get him back on his feet, but it was pretty scary and touch and go for a few days. So we got everything back, but it was okay.
All right. Likewise, what are the top 3 features in Lightroom that you think people are missing out on?
I think primarily people use global edits a lot. So when they're doing an adjustment, they're doing an exposure adjustment or a saturation adjustment or lights and shadows, blacks and whites, and they're doing it over the entire image. As instead of using some of the refined masks and things that we have available in Lightroom now. So you can do some, definitely do some refined edits with masks and linear mask, and we've got a radial mask, and we've got luminosity masks and color masks, and then intersecting masks. So learning how to use those really makes it a lot better, and using the brushes for dodging and burning certain areas of an image as opposed to just doing a global adjustment. I think that's what people miss out on a lot. And I think people miss out on collections, not using collections in their Lightroom catalog. So if they have, a bunch of waterfall images, and they could be from Arkansas and Havasupai and, Croatia or wherever they've been, if they want to have a collection of just waterfall images, they can have a collection. And the nice thing about Lightroom is it doesn't duplicate the image. The image is still the original image that lives in its original folder. You just get to see it with the benefit of a collection, almost like a filter. So you can have as many collections as you want and have, my dogs or waterfalls or family pictures or holidays or whatever it is, and keep all those, really organized so you can find them quite quickly. And then another thing people don't realize is they can share very easily their collections. They can share them to their phone, or they can share them to the web, so they can show them to other people. And a lot of people don't even realize that that's available within Lightroom Classic.
Yeah, that's a really cool feature. I use that a couple times now. It's pretty neat, and especially if you're trying to get other people to help you weed out or cull images or just give you feedback on.
Just to be able to share them straight to your phone. So, when I'm going on a workshop or I'm going on a trip and I've got images from times I've been there before, I'll just create a collection in Lightroom of those specific images, and I can just share those on my phone. So it's really easy when I'm at a workshop to say, okay, well, look, if you walk about, 40 feet further and go around this corner, this is the sort of image you might be able to find, or this is here, or this is here, or this is how I did this before, and maybe that will give you some inspiration to do something else. So it's really handy to have that available, and most people don't even know that you can do that.
One of the features I find a lot of people don't leverage to its maximum potential is just the filtering system, like using colors or numbers or labels, and then you can filter for things later. So if you want to easily find stuff that you think meets certain criteria, or even using the filters within the library to find different metadata, like show me all of the photos that I photographed in 2014 using this lens and this shutter speed. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
You can get really granular with it.
That's a really good point, and a lot of people don't even know that metadata filter exists. But that's really helpful when you're trying to find images. People say, well, I know I downloaded them or I imported them, but I can't find them. They're not anywhere. So if we can figure out, what month it was, or what year it was, or what camera you were shooting it with, or, it's really easy to find it in that metadata filter. And then it's also fun when you're going through images to to even look at your whole catalog and say, okay, well, how many images do I take with my 100-500? Or how many images do I take with a wide angle lens? Or how many images do I take at a high ISO as opposed to a low ISO? And all that metadata information is there right at your fingertips, and you can use it really easily. It's a very powerful tool.
I actually used that 2 years ago now, maybe a year and a half ago. I had, through a very sad story, I lost my 24-105 because I fell into a freezing pool of water with my camera.
Oh, I think I remember that story.
Anyways, I was like, okay, what am I going to replace this 24-105 with? And I wasn't super happy with that lens for various reasons. Like, it doesn't totally resolve fully on the A7R5. And anyway, so I was like, so what focal lengths do I actually use on this lens? So I found all the photos I've ever taken with that lens. And then I just looked at all the different focal lengths that I've ever used with that lens on. And then I put all that into a spreadsheet. And then I created a graph. And I could see that basically I use it a ton at like from 100 to 105. And I use it a ton from 24 to 70. And I didn't use it very much from 70 to 100. Like, I just didn't use that for some reason. So I was like, maybe I could get away with just getting a 20 to 70 and not worry about the 70 to 100 range. And that's exactly what I did.
No, it's really useful. And as I say, for checking ISO and noise and various other things on some of your images and doing comparisons of high ISO images and various noise reduction software, it also helps you do that. So yeah, it's very, very powerful tool. You can also refine it to find all the things that you did on a certain season, like all your winter images or all your fall images, and just have it do August and September, or have it do December and January. So that helps find some of your seasonal images as well.
Yeah. So, trick question for you. There's a wrong answer. No, I don't know. Like, some people might get mad, but can Lightroom really do everything we need now?
Need and want are two different things. If your focus is primarily just on photography and efficient organization, non-destructive editing, preparing photos for print or web, then I think Lightroom Classic can handle everything you need. But you will need additional tools if you want to get into some advanced retouching. So advanced retouching, focus stacking, luminosity masking, composites, video editing especially, because Lightroom isn't very good at that, video editing to say the least. But then, then you have other tools like Photoshop, Premiere Pro, some of the Topaz, some of the plugins. Then you can move on to that. But can you live quite happily in the Lightroom ecosystem? Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I find myself doing probably 60% of my editing in Lightroom, pull it into Photoshop, and then primarily in Photoshop what I'm doing is I'm using luminosity masks, and a lot of the luminosity masking that I'm using I could probably get away with in Lightroom. It just wouldn't be quite as accurate because it's not on the pixel level,
right?
Which is a whole other conversation about the architecture of how Lightroom works. But I think Photoshop has a place still for a professional photographer. With that being said, why should we not be afraid to open Photoshop?
Well, you shouldn't be afraid to open Photoshop because it can feel intimidating, but you don't have to learn the entire Photoshop suite in order to get use out of Photoshop. So it's vast, but you don't need everything to get started. So as long as you can get in there and just gently ease yourself into it by learning the basics of layers and the basics of layers and masking, basic retouching tools, like your clone stamp tool, healing brush, spot healing. And now, of course, we have all this generative remove and generative AI stuff, which is fun to play around with. But working on the adjustment layers and stuff. So if you just want to get in and just work on those little pieces, you don't have to worry about the whole rest of the suite. And then once you get comfortable with that, you could start to introduce the luminosity masking, which really opens up some real creativity. The like you alluded to, the luminosity masking in Lightroom leaves a lot to be desired. It's okay for basics, but what it doesn't do, it doesn't handle the transition zones very well at all. So your gradual gradation from light to shadow isn't as subtle as it is when you use a proper luminosity mask. Either Greg Benz's or Tony Kuiper's, or I use both of them, and they're excellent tools for that. But as I say, you don't have to be afraid of Photoshop. Photoshop comes with the Lightroom Photoshop bundle anyway. So if you can just open it up and learn a few basic things in there, it can open up a lot of possibilities for, creative adjustments.
Yeah, I'll say that I think 2017 was the first time I started using luminosity masks for the first time. And for whatever reason, it just intimidated me. And then I picked up the Tony Kuiper, the TK panel, and then I got the Sean Bagshaw videos and spent the time to actually watch them and practice and see how to use them. And then once I did that, I was like, okay, it's not that hard once you understand what they do and how to use them and what the use cases for using them are. So I think once you get over that hurdle, then it opens up this huge area of opportunity where you can really make some nice refinements to your images. And I think my photography, at least the end result of my photography, has gotten a lot better since I learned that tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with you. But I would say the luminosity masking is similar to the Photoshop suite. You don't have to learn absolutely everything we'll use Tony Kuiper's as an example. His panels do so much. And maybe you don't need to do all of that. You just learn a little bit about some basic masking and do a few little other tricks and just add a few little techniques as you go. And yes, Sean Bagshaw's tutorials are excellent. And I've done the same thing, just sat down and gone through it, piece by piece. And then, of course, once you've figured it out, then Tony comes around and gets a new version, and then you have to relearn it. But God love him, he keeps making it better, so we have to keep learning.
Yeah, I was going to say, I only use probably 20% of what it can do.
Yeah.
I don't know, something like that. It's just, I have my favorite tools that get me where I want to go, and I just use them all the time.
Yep, that's kind of the way I am too. I agree.
All right, well, Suzanne, tell us about your one-on-one instruction that you offer relating to Lightroom and other services.
Okay, so that just started about 10 years ago with just friends that would say, oh, Suzanne knows Lightroom. Let me call her and ask her about, whatever it is, whatever problem I have. And then it just grew into sort of a business, which it is now. I have clients that I work with like on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, or an as-needed basis. Usually it starts with sorting out a mess, I'll get a call, and 90% of my calls start with all of a sudden. So it's like, hi, Suzanne. All of a sudden, all my images disappeared. Or all of a sudden, I can't see anything in the develop module. Or all of a sudden, all these edits that I thought I did aren't there. So it usually starts with sorting out the mess. And that can be a major project. And it can be a question of just finding where folders are, using, the metadata to figure out where things ended up. There's usually some rhyme or reason to it after you get into it. Taking multiple catalogs and merging them into one, and just doing that general cleanup and sort out. Making sure they have proper backups, every time I'm on the phone with a client, I just make sure that the backups are all done every single time, because it's amazing how many times you think you're backing up, but then you're not. And then once we get past that initial, I share a screen with them so I can see their computer and see their work. And I can, make adjustments on their computers. So once we get the messes sorted out, then we can start working on, just post-processing in general, just starting with the basic global adjustments, getting into local, I work on a lot of images for people who are going to put things in contests, or they're going to do a show or something like that. So I work on a bit of post-processing for them. And teaching while I'm doing it. I'm not just, they could just send me the images and I could process them, but that's not helping any. So I like to teach them how to do that. And that's fun. And I fortunately have a number of clients that work in all sorts of different genres. So I have some underwater photographers, I have some studio photographers, people that like to shoot nothing but old cars, just interesting, landscape photographers, obviously, wildlife photographers. So I get to see a lot of interesting images and get to work on a bunch of different techniques. So it's not the same technique for each client. And so that, gradually over time, I get to work with them and see their images improve and they get more comfortable. And as soon as something new comes out, they'll usually contact me and say, okay, how do I work this? What's this? How am I going to use that? So it's been really great. And I started doing it, I was doing it at people's homes locally, but then COVID hit and then everything went online. So I just stayed that way. It's a perfect deal. So I can work with clients all over the world and be here in Scottsdale, and it works out great.
What's the best way for people to learn more about that stuff?
My website. So on my website, there's a whole section on Lightroom Learning, and that's the best way to get a hold of me, either email, phone, just straight through the website. Phone? Yes, I actually answer the phone occasionally.
That's funny. All right, well, that's cool. That's awesome. And I have only a couple more questions for you. So my next to last question, I know that you recently co-led your very first workshop with Munch Workshops at White Sands with one of my favorite human beings on planet Earth, Wayne Suggs.
Me too, my favorite.
How did it go?
It went great. Wayne is, I've known Wayne only just through social media and everything else for quite a while, and just really loved interacting with him. And we're a mutual admiration society when it comes to images. I love his work. It's incredible. And he seems to like my work, which is great too. And so when I met him at White Sands, it was just like we'd known each other for forever. It was wonderful. We seem to have the same philosophy on making images and just being creative. Great group of people. And of course, I love White Sands. That's probably, a lot of people ask me, where's my favorite place to be? And that's probably next to Death Valley, White Sands, and then the Grand Canyon, my favorite places to shoot. White Sands to me is like a completely blank canvas. So every time I go, it's something different. The colors are different. The whole, feel of the place is different. So we had a really great group. We had 8 participants, and Wayne and myself, and we just had a blast. Yeah, it was super.
Awesome. Did he take you over to the petroglyphs?
We didn't, because of the weather. That was the only reason. Yeah, that didn't work out. And I think we missed the full moon, or that would have made it. But next time we go, we'll definitely do that.
Yeah, it's really cool. All right. Last question. Who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some people that we need to learn more about?
Well, there's a number of people, and to narrow it down makes it a little tough. I can think of so many people I'd love to know a little bit more about. But there's a photographer friend of mine from Tucson, Greg McCown, and he's a storm chaser and just a great landscape photographer. He has done some images that I now call the McCown Factor, because he can manage to get, the howling coyote, the rainbow, and the lightning shot all in the same thing. Man. And he's something else. And he's also a real estate agent down there, a very successful real estate agent down in Tucson. So he'd be a really interesting person to talk to. And I love his work. Another person, and she's from Adobe, is Julianne Coast. She is technically the principal digital imaging evangelist at Adobe. That's her official title. But she's a speaker and educator. She does a lot of personal projects, photography personal projects. One of the ones she had done, and what got my attention, was from the window when she was photographing from an airplane window. So a lot of aerial shots like that, but really interesting before sort of drone photography became, as it is. So I always enjoyed those. Oh, it's From the Window Seat is the name of her stuff. But she has gotten some really interesting work lately from Iceland and Antarctica. So not only is she a great educator and speaker, but she also has some pretty amazing imagery too. So she'd be good. And then my good friend is Fritz Rumpf, and he's a relatively new photographer, but his work now has been winning some international competitions, done really well in the Natural Landscape Photography Awards too. And one of his images called Field of Dreams, it's the underside of a mushroom. You may have seen that one. Was recently published in National Geographic in their book, World from Above. But a really hardworking, what I call a hardworking photographer. He's, like I said, relatively new to the scene, but is working hard and is really dedicated to his craft. And I think he'd be a really interesting person to talk to.
Yeah, I love that. I love Fritz's photography, and he's been a longtime supporter of the podcast as well. So I think he's a great recommendation, and I really appreciate that one.
Yeah.
Well, Suzanne, we did it.
We did it. It's been a pleasure, Matt. I really enjoyed it. You're not as scary as I thought.
Well, that's a wrap for episode 412. A huge thank you to Suzanne Mathia for sharing her wealth of knowledge and inspiring us to push our creative boundaries. I hope you picked up some actionable Lightroom tips and fresh ideas for creative cross-training. Don't forget to check out Suzanne's work and connect with her online for more inspiration. Now, before we go, I want to talk about how this podcast stays alive and thriving. F-Stop Collaborate and Listen operates on what's called the value for value model. What does that mean? It's simple. If you find value in the content that I create, I ask that you give back value in whatever way makes sense for you. That could mean supporting the podcast financially through Patreon at patreon.com/fstopandlisten. It can mean sharing episodes with your friends and community, or even leaving a thoughtful review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your support isn't just appreciated, it's essential. It funds everything from hosting fees and recording equipment to the time and energy it takes to produce a high-quality show every single week. This podcast has always been about sharing knowledge and inspiration freely, and with your help, we can keep doing that for years to come. So, if today's episode resonated with you, I invite you to take a moment to give back. Visit patreon.com/fstopandlisten to join our incredible community of supporters. And as always, thank you for listening and for your generosity and for being part of this journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep sharing your unique vision with the world. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.